The Rebels Motorcycle Club has cemented its dominance in the tropical town of Cairns. Known for their tight control and strategic influence, the Rebels have managed to hold their ground despite stringent laws and ongoing efforts by law enforcement to curb their activities. What is actually happening? Today, we will dive into the Rebels' unyielding presence in Cairns, their historical roots, the challenges they've faced, and the impact of their reign on the local community. Recent reports indicate that the Rebels MC, Australia's largest motorcycle club, is dominating the streets of Cairns. This tropical town, the fifth most populous city in Queensland, is located on the northeast coast of far north Queensland. With about 180 members in Queensland, the Rebels MC is a significant presence in the area. In contrast, the Odin's Warriors and Banditos have only a minor presence. Previously, other motorcycle clubs like the Vietnam Veterans and Hells Angels operated in the region. However, they have either left Cairns for Sydney or Melbourne or have joined the Rebels. The Odin's Warriors were once quite active, but their influence waned when authorities shut down 3 of their clubhouses, including their headquarters in Parramatta Park, along with locations on Almulla and Hartley Streets. This crackdown also saw several high-ranking members arrested. The Odin's Warriors MC, founded in 1971, was initially formed by military veterans who shared a love for motorcycles and partying with like-minded individuals. Today, however, their presence in Cairns is much diminished, leaving the Rebels MC as the dominant force in the region. The Odin's Warriors Motorcycle Club was founded with the primary purpose of promoting safe and socially responsible conduct among motorcycle enthusiasts. Despite this positive mission, the introduction of the Vicious Lawless Association Disestablishment Act in 2013 had a significant impact on the club in Queensland. This legislation led to the disruption of several key events organised by the Odin's Warriors, such as the Purga Creek Rock Concert, the Brisbane Street Custom Bike Show, and the Brisbane Tattoo Show. These events were important not only for the club members, but also for the community, as they raised substantial funds for various charitable causes. The anti-association laws also led to the closure of the Odin's Warriors clubhouses, making it difficult for members to gather and socialize. This, in turn, contributed to a decline in their membership. While the Odin's Warriors struggled under these new restrictions, the Rebels MC continued to thrive. Queensland has long been a stronghold for the Rebels, who operate 6 chapters across the state in locations like Cairns, Townsville, Charters Towers, Mount Isa, Rockhampton, and Mackay.in Cairns. The Rebels are particularly dominant. Their influence extends beyond just their visible presence on the streets. They are also alleged to be involved in various forms of organized crime, including drug trafficking, extortion, and other illegal activities. This combination of street dominance and involvement in criminal enterprises has allowed the Rebels to wield considerable influence in the broader Cairns community, far surpassing that of the Odin's Warriors and other rival motorcycle clubs. The Rebels MC's ability to maintain control over Cairns gives them a strategic advantage, allowing them to conduct their operations with minimal interference from rival biker clubs and law enforcement agencies. While the Rebels have about 180 members in Queensland, their numbers could be much higher if not for the Vicious Lawless Association Disestablishment Act of 2013. These tough laws were later reinforced by amendments to serious and organized crime legislation in 2016, further hampering the growth of the club. Additionally, many Bikie clubhouses were shut down due to the restricted premises legislation, leading to a noticeable absence of recognized biker clubhouses throughout Queensland. Law enforcement has also become more vigilant, proactively closing any newly emerging premises with the help of Task Force Maxima. These measures have led to a decline in the overall bikie club business since the introduction of these anti-biker laws, alongside the success of ongoing police operations disrupting their criminal networks. Before these laws were enacted, biker clubs played a significant role in the supply and manufacture of illicit drugs like LSD, ecstasy, methamphetamines, and cannabis. They were involved in all aspects of the drug trade, from production to distribution to extortion. For the rebels, their stronghold in Cairns means more than just dominance on the streets. It provides them with a strategic position to conduct their activities with reduced risk of interference, maintaining their influence and operations despite the heavy legal crackdown. This control over Cairns not only allows them to continue their illicit activities, but also reinforces their reputation and power within the broader community, making it difficult for other clubs or law enforcement to challenge their authority effectively. The combination of strategic advantage and ongoing criminal activities underlines the rebels' significant and resilient presence in the region. The rebels' MC's stronghold in Cairns effectively prevents rival motorcycle clubs from freely operating in the area. Their tight control acts as a strong deterrent, making it nearly impossible for other clubs to establish a presence or conduct operations in Cairns. Experts describe the rebels, especially those based in Cairns, as embodying the old-school biker image. They maintain traditional Aussie biker culture through their appearance and core values, although they also embrace a more contemporary and lavish affiliation with the club. This sets them apart from the younger generation of bikers, known as the Nike Bikies. Nike Bikies are distinctly modern and fashion-forward. They prioritize their appearance, avoiding the traditional look of older bikers. They stay on top of fashion trends, never dressing in the old-school biker style. These younger bikers are also dedicated to fitness, often using steroids, and are known for their striking tattoos, gold chains, designer clothes, and trendy hairstyles. These younger bikers, known as Nike Bikies, not only love the nightclub scene, but also use their expensive club-themed clothing to proudly show their allegiance. Their unique mix of luxury style and club identity sets them apart from the more traditional old-school members. Despite tough laws and efforts to stop their activities, biker clubs continue to have a presence in Queensland. State law enforcement has tried various strategies to dismantle these groups, including strict anti-gang laws and court orders. However, the resilience and adaptability of these bikers allow them to persist, often operating underground and changing their tactics to avoid detection. The ongoing presence of the rebels in Queensland highlights the complexity of dealing with organized crime. It shows the need for continuous vigilance and innovative strategies to address this persistent issue. The rebels' MC features a Confederate flag with a skull wearing a cap and a 1% patch in the center. While the Australian government and law enforcement view the rebels as a criminal organization, the club insists they are simply motorcycle enthusiasts, not gangsters. During the 1970s and 1980s, the rebels' MC steadily grew and expanded, establishing chapters in various Australian states. They became known as one of the most prominent and well-organized outlaw motorcycle clubs in the country. Over the years, like many other outlaw clubs, the rebels have faced numerous allegations and legal challenges related to criminal activities, including drug trafficking, violence, and involvement in organized crime. They have also been involved in conflicts with rival motorcycle clubs, such as the Banditos, the Lone Wolves, and the Hells Angels. Despite these challenges, the rebels have maintained their presence and influence across Australia. The leadership of the rebels' MC has changed over time, with various national presidents at the helm. A significant change occurred when former national president Alex Bella faced legal issues and was stranded in Malta after a visit in 2014. Damien Vella then took over as national president. The rebels' constitution states that they are a non-profit organization promoting the riding of Harley-Davidson motorcycles. Members are only allowed to join the club once and are not permitted to join any other motorcycle club. In 2011, the rebels expanded internationally, by establishing their first chapters in New Zealand. Members of the rebels MC were seen wearing their patches throughout New Zealand's North Island, showing they had established a presence despite resistance from local law enforcement. This expansion led to conflicts with existing motorcycle clubs, like the Tribesmen, with reports suggesting the rebels aimed to take over the Tribesman gang. The threat of the rebels settling in New Zealand prompted police action. In 2011, police asked the Wanganui District Council to ban the wearing of rebels' patches, highlighting their concern about the gang's expansion. Although the rebels MC claims to be a group of motorcycle enthusiasts and not gangsters, the Australian government and law enforcement consider the club a criminal organisation. Over the years, the rebels have faced significant scrutiny and legal pressure due to their alleged involvement in various illegal activities.
In the world of outlaw motorcycle clubs, the arrival of the Canadian Rock Machine in Australia sparked an intense and violent rivalry with the local rebels MC. The Rock Machine, already infamous for its brutal history back in Canada, decided to expand in 2008 by opening a chapter in Perth. But this didn't go down well with the rebels, and what started as a fight over turf quickly turned into a full-on war. There were firebombings, assassination attempts, and violent clashes. This is the story of the bitter feud between the Rock Machine and the rebels in Australia. To understand how the Rock Machine ended up in Australia, let's rewind to Canada. The Rock Machine was founded in late 1986 by Salvatore Cazzetta and his brother Giovanni. At the time, Salvatore had just split from the Hells Angels after a horrific event known as the Lennoxville Massacre, where the Hells Angels turned on their own members, killing several and dumping their bodies into the St. Lawrence River. For Cazzetta, this was a breach of the code, something he could never forgive. So, he broke away and founded the Rock Machine MC. The Rock Machine grew quickly in Montreal, and for a while, things seemed to be going smoothly, especially since Cazzetta had a solid friendship with Maurice Mom Boucher, the president of the Hells Angels Quebec chapter, which helped to keep tensions low. But that peace didn't last. In 1994, Cazzetta was jailed for drug trafficking, leaving the Rock Machine without strong leadership. This gave Boucher a chance to attack, using Hells Angels puppet clubs to take over the drug markets the Rock Machine had controlled, which sparked the bloody Quebec Biker War. I'll leave a link to that video at the end if you're curious about the details. The war lasted from 1994 to 2002 and caused over 150 deaths, including innocent civilians caught in the crossfire. Boucher even allegedly offered up to $100,000 for killing a Rock Machine member. By the end of the war, the Rock Machine was severely weakened. They had no choice but to disband and join forces with the Bandidos MC to survive. But the Bandidos soon ran into their own problems, leaving many former Rock Machine members without a club. In 2008, a group of ex-Bandidos and former Mongols decided it was time to revive the Rock Machine. A second version of the Rock Machine was born in Winnipeg, and they decided to keep the original black and platinum colors for their patch. Although they started off as a smaller club, they quickly began to spread their wings internationally. If you're tuning in from Australia, chances are you've heard of Brent Wrecker, also known as The Rock. This guy didn't waste any time making a name for himself in the Aussie motorcycle scene. He had big dreams, claiming he would be the biggest and baddest biker in Australia, and he definitely wanted to look the part. Covered in tattoos from head to toe, he'd say. While others hung art on their walls, he wore his on his skin. According to his mom, Brent was just a regular kid growing up. But by the time he was 17, he knew exactly what he wanted to do and told her he was going to start his own motorcycle club. While Brent had plenty of ambition, he wasn't alone in his plans. A number of other big names in the motorcycle community were also keen on bringing the Rock Machine to Australia. They reached out to the Canadian Rock Machine and asked if they could set up shop in Oz. The Canadian chapter agreed, and in 2008, the first Rock Machine chapter in Perth was officially formed, with Brent stepping up as the Sergeant-at-Arms. The Rock Machine quickly gained traction in Australia, and it didn't take long for another chapter to open in Sydney in early 2009. By then, the Perth chapter alone had grown to over 20 members, and they had expanded into Eastern Australia, creating new chapters that brought the total membership to about 60, including the Sydney crew. On December 4th, 2009, the Rock Machine held its first national event in Australia, with more than 80 members coming together in Perth to celebrate. In the world of bikie culture, clashes are pretty much unavoidable, and the existing clubs took notice of the fresh faces in town. At first, the trouble was limited to pub brawls and street fights, but things really escalated when Critical J launched a new Rock Machine chapter in the suburbs of Perth. This move was seen as a direct challenge by rival clubs, especially the Rebels, who weren't too happy about sharing their turf. The Rebels are a huge force in Australia's bikie world. At their peak, they had around 70 chapters spread across the country and over 1,000 members, making them by far the largest motorcycle club in Australia. But it's not just their size that gets them noticed. There have been suspicions about their involvement in everything from drug trafficking to extortion and even tax evasion. On the other side, the Rock Machine was the new kid on the block. Despite being smaller, they didn't hesitate to take on a giant like the Rebels. The rivalry started off small, with online threats and trash talk between members, but things really started to escalate when a few young rebels decided to jump ship and join the Rock Machine, eager to earn their full patch. By July 10th, 2010, the tension finally boiled over into a violent brawl at a nightclub, which left multiple people, including some police officers, injured. A few months later, in October 2010, the Rock Machine upped the ante by firebombing a car owned by a Rebels member. Then, on November 5th, 2010, things exploded at a mixed martial arts event. Around 20 people from both clubs were involved in a wild fight, and witnesses say several Rebels were injured. Just a week later, on November 12th, about 15 Rebels rode through Fremantle's entertainment district, looking for any Rock Machine members bold enough to flash their colors, but they came up empty. 4 days later, the Rock Machine struck back by setting fire to the Inca Salt Tattoo Shop, a business linked to the Rebels. The fire broke out early in the morning, and when firefighters arrived, it was clear this wasn't an accident. Police later confirmed the arson was linked to the Rock Machine. As the violence escalated, things got even more destructive. A Rebels member's car was firebombed, and another member's house was trashed and ransacked. On November 29, 2010, police pulled over a Rock Machine member during a routine traffic stop and found an arsenal of high-powered guns, including rifles, a shotgun, and plenty of ammo. With each side stepping up their game, the war was far from over. In early 2011, members from both clubs clashed again, this time at the Click nightclub in Fremantle, leaving several people injured. The very next day, a Rock Machine member discovered his Spearwood tattoo shop had been vandalized. In January 2011, things took an even darker turn when the Rebels struck again. A Rock Machine member's tattoo parlor was wrecked, and the manager was beaten by a group of Rebels. Just a few days later, on January 24th, the police decided to take action. They rammed an armored vehicle through the front gate of the Rebels' Osborne Chapter Clubhouse. Tactical response officers stormed the place, using an angle grinder to cut through the security gate, then threw stun grenades inside. After all that, the police found absolutely nothing of value. This led to the Rebels' Western Australia president, Nick Martin, demanding that the government foot the bill for the damage to their clubhouse. In February, on the 25th, the police raided the Rock Machine clubhouse in Perth, where they discovered a massive stash of high-grade explosives. And we're not talking about a small stash. There were enough detonators and industrial-strength gel to blow up a large building. But despite the huge raid and explosives bust, the violence didn't stop. On March 18, 2011, Nick Martin himself became the target of an assassination attempt right outside his Perth home. He was shot, with the bullet hitting his elbow. Miraculously, Martin survived, requiring only minor surgery, and he later got a tattoo around the bullet scar that read, "Better luck next time." Just days later, on March 24, 2011, the police raided 9 properties across Australia, cracking down hard on both the Rock Machine and the Rebels. The raids uncovered a stash of weapons, including over a dozen rifles, a military practice mortar, and hundreds of rounds of ammo. However, despite the scale of the operation, only 2 people were actually charged. One of them was a Rock Machine member, who was charged for the earlier attempt on Nick Martin's life. In early 2012, the Rock Machine continued to grow, strengthening their presence in Perth by establishing a second chapter known as the South Side or City Crew Perth chapter. This expansion was fueled by defections from the Finks Motorcycle Club, with several Finks members making the switch to the Rock Machine. The Finks, like the Rock Machine, had long been at odds with the Rebels, and now even more Finks members from Eastern Australia began joining the Rock Machine, as authorities in Queensland had labeled them a criminal organization and started tightening the noose around their operations. As for Brent Wrecker, he didn't stay out of trouble. In 2011, he was arrested along with another member for extortion and making threats. In November 2012, Western Australia passed one of the toughest laws aimed at cracking down on organized crime, especially targeting motorcycle clubs. The new law gave police the power to ask a judge to label certain groups as criminal organizations if they were involved in illegal activities or posed a threat to the public. While it took about a year for the law to fully kick in, it started making some younger members think twice about sticking around. On top of that, frequent police raids only added more pressure on the Rock Machine. By 2013, the club found itself in a tough spot, with one of their Perth chapters switching allegiance to the Bandidos. Although it looked like the Rock Machine was on the ropes, they were far from finished. For the next few years, the club kept a low profile. While authorities couldn't pin down their activities, they knew the Rock Machine wasn't completely gone. By 2015, rumors about the club's comeback were spreading. Local outlets reported that the Rock Machine was active again in places like Christie's Beach and Seaford. In 2018, sightings of the Rock Machine were confirmed, with members sporting their emblem and the words "Rock Machine Nomads." Soon after, authorities confirmed the Rock Machine had resumed operations by reopening their Perth clubhouse. This only reignited tensions with the rebels, and soon, reports of arson and drive-by shootings started popping up again. Then, on December 12, 2020, a tragic event took place at the Perth Motorplex. On that sunny afternoon, families were enjoying a drag racing event, unaware of the danger lurking among them. Nick Martin, the former president of the Rebels, was there watching the event when a bullet suddenly tore through the air, hitting him in the chest. Chaos erupted as people scrambled to safety, unsure if more shots were coming. Martin passed away at the scene. Authorities immediately launched an investigation, with over 100 officers working on the case. Task Force REL raided properties, smashed down doors, and arrested people in their search for the shooter. While no one was officially named as the culprit at the time, all eyes naturally turned to the Rock Machine. However, 3 months later, an ex-Army sharpshooter was arrested and sentenced to 20 years in prison. The shooter made a critical mistake that led to his capture. He took his rifle to a licensed gunsmith for a barrel replacement a month after the shooting. This slip-up allowed investigators to trace the modified weapon and match it to the bullet recovered from the scene. But that wasn't all. The police also found another crucial piece of evidence, a shoe impression, which was identified as a Fila running shoe. CCTV footage later confirmed that the shooter had been at the Perth Motorplex multiple times, each time wearing those exact shoes. Mobile phone towers placed the suspect at the sniper's position just before Nick Martin was shot, and shortly after, the phone was switched off, likely to avoid being tracked. But by then, the pieces of the puzzle were already starting to come together. Police put the shooter under surveillance and later followed him to a bushland area in Warborough, where they found $249,500 buried in PVC pipes. During sentencing, the shooter cooperated with authorities in exchange for a lighter sentence. He revealed that he had been hired by Davyy, a former Rebels member, to carry out the hit. The shooter explained how he had surveilled Martin's movements, conducted drone flybys around his house, and even practiced his shot before taking the 300-meter shot at the Motorplex. He claimed he was promised $150,000 for the job. He also mentioned that Pai had offered to pay him to take out a woman and a senior command figure, Cheryl Raid Silly, who was living in Thailand. Davyy pleaded not guilty to all charges when he appeared in court. On December 25, 2020, curious onlookers watched as 200 patched rebels escorted Nick Martin's coffin, which was decorated with $100 bills. A convoy of police cars trailed behind, while a police sniper and a helicopter kept watch from above. Despite this grand show of brotherhood, tensions within the rebels had been brewing for months. There were suspicions that Martin had misappropriated club funds, and he was ultimately ousted from his leadership role after being blamed for transferring members to the Mongols earlier in 2020. The plot thickened further when police discovered that, during Martin's funeral, his home had been robbed, with over $20,000 stolen from his widow.
Up to 100 bikies brought traffic to a standstill today as hearses and Harleys rode in formation to the funeral of slain Rebels boss Nick Martin. Police tracked their every movement from the ground and...
Meet Big Nick Martin. This guy was huge, not just in size but in reputation. Seriously, imagine him drenched in red, burning hot sauce. Can't picture it? Well, take a look at this. But here's the kicker. Big Nick got taken down by Dane Brajkovic. And when I say taken down, I don't just mean a loss, it was an insult. Nick, who was once unstoppable, was suddenly stopped in his tracks. People called him the Man Mountain for a reason. This guy wasn't just big, he was like a walking fortress, a human skyscraper towering over everyone. But then, December 12, 2020 happened. Perth Motorplex, drag races roaring, nearly 2,000 people watching, floodlights slicing through the dark night. And in the shadows, a threat waiting. At 8:30 p.m., from 335 meters away, a sniper took aim. One breath, one squeeze of the trigger, one bullet, and just like that, Nick Martin slumped in his seat. "Babe, I've been shot," he said. Was that the end of his story? Or is there more to tell? Let's dive in and find out. Nick was born in 1969 in the UK to Sid and R. Martin, but by the time he was 6 months old, his family packed up and moved to Australia, looking for a fresh start. The 1970s were shaping an entire generation. Nick's childhood wasn't full of drama or hardship, far from it. He spent his days outdoors, riding bikes down dusty roads, climbing trees with scraped knees to prove it, and getting lost in the bush. No mobile phones, no internet, just pure freedom. Life was simple. Back then, black and white TVs were still a thing, and families had their own rhythms. Mums at home, dads at work, and kids running in and out of each other's homes without knocking. But even with all this, Nick somehow found his way into the outlaw world. He didn't fall into it out of desperation, nor was he pulled in by a bad crowd. Some guys are just built for rules, and others, well, they're made to break them. And Nick? He was definitely the second type. He didn't get recruited. He stepped right into the outlaw life on his own terms. At 17, he dropped out of school, left home, and entered a world where survival meant standing your ground. His first stop? Not a party, but a nightclub. Not as a guest, but as a bouncer. It was a tough job, throwing him right into the deep end with Perth's roughest crowds. It was here that he learned. Power doesn't wait to be handed to you, you take it. But with that power came trouble. By 18, Nick was already on the police radar. In 1988, he was arrested for dangerous driving and slapped with a massive $22,000 fine. For most people, that would be the start of some serious issues. But for Nick, it was just the beginning. The run-ins with the law didn't stop there. In 1996, he got involved in a fight at Aqua nightclub and ended up with a $2,000 fine for assault. Nick wasn't just walking the line between right and wrong, he was dancing all over it. And every time, he got a little deeper into the world that would eventually make him infamous. It didn't take long for Nick to rise in the ranks of the Rebels Motorcycle Club in Perth. He earned respect fast, and by the time he became the WA president of the club, he was a force to be reckoned with. This guy didn't just wear the Rebels patch, he was the Rebels. But we'll get to how he pulled that off later. Nick's story really took off in 2005. The Rebels were going through some major changes with their longtime leader locked up. It was the perfect moment for Nick to step in. He was sharp, ambitious, and had the sheer guts to take control. By 2008, he had already carved out his space, running Western Australia with an iron fist. Standing nearly 6 feet 5 inches, he became known as the Man Mountain, and he didn't just stick to the old biker look. He swapped denim for high-end streetwear, creating a whole new image. Nick wasn't just a biker, he was a brand. He was reshaping what it meant to be an outlaw. By 2011, Nick officially became the WA president of the Rebels, and his rise to power wasn't quiet. He wasn't just rising in the ranks, he was taking over the entire club. His influence spread like wildfire. Under his leadership, the Rebels weren't just a group of bikers, they were an empire. But, of course, with all that power came constant challenges. One of the biggest came in 2009 when the Canadian rock machine MC tried to establish a presence in Perth. Nick wasn't having it. A full-scale turf war erupted. Fights spilled into the streets, cars were bombed, and any place tied to the conflict was a target. It got so bad, it almost cost Nick his life in 2011 when someone tried to assassinate him. But, of course, he survived, and the rebels' grip on Western Australia remained strong. Nick didn't just clash with rival gangs, he also had no problem going toe-to-toe with the police. In 2010, when they raided a rebels' clubhouse and came up with nothing, Nick didn't just back down, he went straight for them, challenging the authorities in a way most bikers would shy away from. And, just like that, Nick Martin's legend grew even bigger. Nick Martin made a bold move. He publicly demanded the authorities pay for the damage they caused, sending a clear message. The rebels weren't just any outlaw club, they were a force that deserved respect. His influence wasn't just felt in Western Australia. While the national leadership focused on expanding the rebels internationally, Nick's chapter was the one that planted their flag in New Zealand by 2011. This move helped solidify the club as a true biker empire. For years, Nick was untouchable, respected, feared, and became the face of the club's power. But, as they say, the higher you go, the harder you fall. By mid-2020, just months before his death, cracks started showing in Nick's empire. Whispers about dodgy financial dealings started circulating. Allegations emerged that he'd been using club funds to pay for some seriously luxurious home renovations. In a world where loyalty is everything, this kind of betrayal is a deadly sin. The backlash was swift, and by the end of 2020, Nick was no longer president of the rebels. Criminal charges signaled a deep split within the organization. The man who was once at the top now found himself on the outside. A reminder that in the outlaw world, power is never permanent, and without the club's protection, you have nothing. Through it all, Martin stuck to his own rules. Unlike other leaders who looked for alliances, he kept the rebels fiercely independent. He focused on strengthening his own team rather than making uneasy deals with others. But, as with any outlaw life, personal relationships weren't immune to the harsh realities of the world he lived in. Nick had once worked side by side with Alex Vell, the rebels' national president, trying to keep WA loyal during tough times. But not all relationships stayed solid. One of the most brutal betrayals came from David Pye, a former rebel who jumped ship to the Ceros. That sparked a personal feud with deadly consequences. Beyond the club's violent world, Nick was a family man. In 2005, the same year he fully joined the rebels, he met Amanda, known as Shoppy. She would become his loyal partner in everything. His family, including his parents Sid and Roa, and his sister Renee, described him as intensely loyal, a quality that shaped both his personal and club relationships. But even in his personal life, tragedy struck. In 2010, his close friend Mario Perrin, whom Nick had personally brought into the rebels, was shot dead in front of his own family. This wasn't just a murder, it was a brutal message that no one, not even Nick's closest allies, was safe. By 2018, Nick's hold on the club was starting to slip. Legal troubles were mounting with serious charges hanging over him: extortion, laundering, and tax evasion. Internal dissatisfaction also boiled over. Allegations that he had been misusing club funds, including the mandatory $100 per member weekly dues, led to a full-blown mutiny. In 2018, Nick resigned from his official role as a president. But this wasn't a full retreat, it was a strategic move to steady the club's ship as it started to crack. Even after stepping down, Nick still pulled the strings behind the scenes through his trusted ally Carl Lebrook, who took over leadership in WA. But the tensions within the club didn't disappear. Rival gangs sensed weakness and waited for the right moment to strike. Nick's legacy was a wild mix of audacity, betrayal, and an ongoing power struggle. And it all came to a head on November 24, 2020, at the Sandbar in Scarborough. What started as a simple handshake between two heavyweights in the outlaw world quickly turned into chaos. Nick, once the most powerful figure in the rebels, found himself face to face with Davyy Brajkovic, the Hells Angels' feared sergeant-at-arms. Known for his brutal reputation, Davyy wasn't someone you messed with. The CCTV footage tells the story. What began as a calm moment turned into a full-on brawl in the blink of an eye. Davyy struck first, landing punch after punch, sending Nick reeling. Chairs flew, drinks spilled, and for a few wild moments the sandbar became a battleground. In the aftermath, Davyy pleaded guilty to public fighting and walked away with an $800 fine. But for Nick, the consequences were far worse. This wasn't just a fist fight, it was a statement. The once untouchable Man Mountain had taken a public beating, a blow to his pride that showed everyone his power was slipping. Nick was rushed to the hospital, humiliated and injured. A defeat no outlaw biker would ever willingly take. Inside the sandbar, the atmosphere shifted. Bystanders knew this wasn't just another scrap between bikers, it was a pivotal moment in the outlaw world. The police were on edge, fearing that this public humiliation could spark a full-blown war between the rebels and the Hells Angels. Perth was on the brink of becoming a battleground. Davyy Brajkovic wasn't just some thug, he was a trained fighter, a former cage fighter with serious skills. On that night, he showed exactly why you don't mess with him. Despite Nick's size and reputation, Davyy dominated the fight, landing blow after blow. But even as the punishment kept coming, Nick didn't completely break. Shaken, but still composed, he walked away from the altercation without immediately sparking a war. But the damage had been done. To outsiders, it might have looked like just another biker brawl, but to those in the know, it was a clear sign that the power balance was shifting. The assassination. The beating at the sandbar stripped Nick Martin of his once unshakable image. The whispers began almost immediately. Would Martin strike back? Would the rebels retaliate? One thing was certain, this wasn't over. December 12, 2020, 8:30 p.m., Perth Motorplex, Kwinana Beach. The night pulsed with the roar of drag racers, the scent of burning rubber, and the buzz of nearly 2,000 fans. Families, kids, adrenaline junkies. No one expected the night's spectacle would end in blood. Nick Martin, relaxed and unsuspecting, was among the crowd. It wasn't the dark back streets or secret clubhouses he usually haunted. He was in plain sight, surrounded by hundreds. Then, in an instant, everything changed. A single shot rang out, precise, deafening, final. Fired from a high-powered .308 caliber rifle, the bullet traveled 335 meters, over 3 football fields, with surgical accuracy. It tore through the noise of revving engines and excited cheers and struck its target. Martin slumped forward in his seat. "Babe, I've been shot," he muttered. His wife Amanda thought it was a heart attack, until she saw the blood. Panic erupted. The crowd scattered. Families ran screaming. Shocked spectators stood frozen, watching chaos unfold. CCTV later confirmed it. This was no random act. It was a cold, calculated execution, a professional hit. The bullet passed cleanly through Martin, continuing its deadly trajectory. It struck Ricky Chapman, the partner of Martin's stepdaughter, and even grazed Martin's young step-grandson. One shot. 3 lives changed. A brutal message delivered with brutal precision. Speculation exploded. Was it a rival gang? A sniper for hire? A betrayal from within? The shooter had vanished without a trace. What remained was the chilling aftermath. A public hit on one of Australia's most powerful outlaw bikers. The aftermath. This wasn't just another biker feud. It was a seismic shift. Nick Martin, once known as the Man Mountain, had been taken out in front of thousands. In broad daylight, the symbolism was unmistakable. Power, fear, untouchability, obliterated in a single gunshot. The motorplex descended into chaos. Law enforcement scrambled, outlaw circles buzzed. Whoever ordered the hit hadn't just killed a man, they'd redefined the rules of the underworld. And then came the revelations. The sniper wasn't some thug with a gun. He was a 34-year-old former Special Forces soldier, a trained marksman. No criminal record, no gang ties, just deadly skill, precision, and a mission. He had scouted the motorplex for weeks, identified Martin's usual seat, slipped in through a hole he'd cut in the fence days earlier, removed a safety ramp to ensure an uninterrupted line of sight. Practiced his shots. Then, with the calm of a soldier on deployment, he took the shot. It was cold, clean, final. But the most damning truth came later. The hit had been ordered, funded, orchestrated. At the center of it all, Davyy Pye, a former rebel, once close to Martin, now a senior figure in the rival Comancheros. Their bond had long since turned to venom, and Pye had done what few thought possible. He reached out from the shadows and brought down the giant. The sniper was no lone wolf. He was a hired assassin, executing a meticulously planned hit. Court records revealed everything: preparation, logistics, precision. It was surgical, ruthless, professional. The message crystal clear. In this world, no one is untouchable. Marksman. Under the crushing weight of a murder conviction, the hitman finally broke. He confessed everything, each chilling detail of the assassination that shook Australia's outlaw world to its core. It wasn't just about pulling the trigger. He'd been paid for the weeks of planning, the military-grade precision, and above all, his silence. But the silence didn't last. After collecting a portion of his final payment, the cracks began to show. Court documents revealed an even darker plan. Davyy Pye, the mastermind, had already lined up another high-value target and was ready to use the same sniper again. Another payday, another body, another shift in power. But before the second act could play out, the sniper and Pye were arrested. The trial. When the case went to trial, the evidence was damning. The marksman, once a ghost, was now fully unmasked. A former Special Forces soldier turned assassin for hire, sentenced to 20 years in prison with parole possible after 18. His cooperation, especially his willingness to testify against Pye, spared him the harshest sentence. Pye, meanwhile, now faced trial for orchestrating the execution of a man he had once called a brother. Nick Martin, a fellow rebel, a comrade on the road, now a target. Martin's pending legal battles, extortion, tax evasion, allegations involving his wife Amanda, were dismissed. A dead man can't stand trial, but the chaos left in the wake of his death had become the new focus. The assassin's method. The sniper's kill wasn't some sloppy street hit. It was a masterclass in cold, calculated violence. After the shot, he didn't flee in a panic. He moved with the same methodical precision that had defined the entire operation. He ditched his gear, replaced the barrel of his rifle to avoid forensic detection, and vanished. But even his military discipline couldn't outmaneuver science forever. Ballistics matched the bullet. Footprints linked to a rare brand of shoes. Phone data nailed the timeline. Then came the money. Investigators uncovered $150,000 hidden in PVC pipes, blood money, the sniper's cut. It led them right back to Pye, nicknamed the Baker, now accused of ordering Martin's execution and plotting others, including a rival Comanchero leader. His elaborate power grab had detonated in his face. In December 2021, the sniper pled guilty to 4 charges, including murder. A dramatic courtroom moment. But the story wasn't over. His cooperation came with strings. If he ever refused to testify against Pye, his sentence could be revisited. Pye's trial, delayed until 2025, remains a powder keg waiting to ignite. The power shift. Nick Martin's death wasn't just a biker feud, it was a tectonic shift in Australia's outlaw biker landscape. Almost overnight, law enforcement pressure surged. Surveillance intensified. Politicians and citizens alike were forced to confront just how deeply outlaw motorcycle clubs had embedded themselves into society. Inside the rebels, the loss was catastrophic. Martin hadn't just been a figurehead, he was the stabilizing force in Western Australia. With him gone, the local chapter splintered. The national leadership scrambled to plug the hole, appointing a new WA president. But it was too late. Internal conflict erupted. Members defected. Rivals, like the Comancheros and Hells Angels, smelled blood. Then came the ultimate betrayal. Martin's successor in WA defected, switching sides to the Comancheros, the very club linked to Martin's death. That move shattered what was left of rebel dominance in the region. The streets react. Martin's assassination opened the floodgates for chaos. The rebels were reeling, and the streets buzzed with a dangerous energy. Comancheros and Hells Angels surged forward, eager to carve up the territory Martin had once ruled. But it wasn't just outlaw clubs fighting in the shadows. Law enforcement came down hard. Operation Rello was launched, one of the largest policing efforts in Western Australia's history. Over 100 officers from homicide, gang crime, and intelligence units united under one mission: shut it down. The Joker's Law. This wasn't just another hit. It was a sniper shot that turned into a symbol. A lawless public execution made in broad daylight before thousands was a line in the sand, a declaration of war, and it forced everyone, cops, bikers, citizens, to confront a brutal new truth. In the outlaw world, no one is untouchable. Not even Nick Martin, not even the King. Crackdown. The mission was clear: find the killer, shut down the chaos, stop the next hit before it happened. But the police didn't stop at passive investigation. Raids stormed through properties linked to bikie gangs across Western Australia. Clubhouses, stash houses, and known associate hangouts were all hit with force. The message was blunt: no more business as usual. Then came Martin's funeral, and the authorities weren't taking any chances. A heavy law enforcement presence surrounded the event. Plainclothes officers mingled with mourners. Patrols flanked nearby streets. Aerial units circled above. Everyone knew how these stories usually ended: a funeral followed by fire, retaliation, violence, blood, but not that day. Despite the rising tension, thick enough to cut, the rebels buried Martin without violence. No shootouts, no ambushes, just silence, respect, and a storm brewing beneath the surface. Legislative warfare. For the Western Australia government, Nick Martin's assassination wasn't just a gangland murder, it was a spectacle. A sniper's bullet had shattered the illusion that these conflicts could stay in the shadows. It became the tipping point. In the weeks following, lawmakers pushed through some of the toughest anti-bikie laws Australia had ever seen. Club colors, insignia, and tattoos banned. Wearing them in public, up to 12 months in prison. Anti-consorting laws tightened. Even being seen associating with known gang members could lead to charges. No more brotherhood in the open. No more patch pride. No more untouchables. Government officials openly pointed to Martin's public execution as the catalyst for the crackdown, and it worked. The rebels, and every other outlaw motorcycle club, felt the heat instantly. Police powers surged. Surveillance blanketed the streets. Officers, now armed with legal authority, broke up gatherings, made arrests for wearing colors, and kept relentless tabs on key members. The bickies had long been at war with each other. Now, the government had joined the fight. The funeral, December 23, 2020. Martin's farewell was more than a ceremony. It was a statement. A roaring convoy of rebel bikers rolled through Perth, their engines howling in unison. Above them, a police helicopter circled like a vulture, a sniper scanning the crowd below from a marksman's perch. The air buzzed with unspoken threat. Martin's casket, wrapped in $100 bills, was both tribute and myth, a symbol of power, wealth, and danger carried to the grave. But inside the service, another side of Nick Martin emerged. Some called him a teddy bear, a paradox, a man feared on the streets but loved fiercely by his inner circle. To the world, he was a criminal titan. To his family, he was dad, husband, friend. He was the man who took bullets for his patch, the man who stood tall until the very last second. A collision course. Martin's assassination wasn't just the end of a life, it was the start of a war between two forces that couldn't coexist, the underworld and the state. One built on secrecy and violence, the other now armed with laws, resources, and resolve. The sniper's bullet lit the fuse, the crackdown brought the fire. And still, the battle raged. On the streets, in the courts, in the hearts of those chasing power or vengeance. Before his death, Nick Martin looked like he'd been ripped straight out of a crime saga. Broad-shouldered, ink-covered, and always in the thick of it. Martin wasn't just part of the bikie world, he was the scene. Every clash with the law, every feud with rivals, only sharpened his legend. In Perth, his name wasn't just recognized, it was revered, feared, and whispered in every corner of the outlaw world. The more violent the world became, the bigger he loomed. Martin didn't just live the outlaw life, he owned it. But it wasn't his brawls or power plays that made him a household name, it was his death. A sniper's bullet ended him, not in a quiet alley, but at a family-friendly event, in front of innocent bystanders. It wasn't just a hit, it was a public execution, and Australia watched it unfold in horror. In an instant, Martin's name exploded beyond Perth, beyond bikie circles, into national headlines, talk shows, and parliament debates. Footage of Martin being jumped by a rival weeks earlier had already made waves. But this was different. This was surgical, cold, brazen, a move that screamed, "No one is safe." Amid the outrage and media frenzy, there was something else. Sympathy, because this wasn't just a story of underworld revenge. His family saw it happen. His wife, Amanda, and their daughter were right there when the bullet struck. The cameras captured the chaos, but not the soul-crushing horror of watching someone you love gunned down in a split second. At the funeral, a sea of rebel bikers rode through Perth, their thunderous procession impossible to ignore. To some, it was a show of force. To others, it was a broken family grieving inside a world where loyalty and violence walked hand in hand. Martin's casket was draped in $100 bills, a bold symbol of the life he lived. Big money, big power, big risks. Some called him a criminal kingpin, others a loyal friend. But to his family, he was simply theirs. Michael Davyy was known as the Prince of Penrith, a top figure in the rebels' bikie gang, feared by many and respected by his crew. But in 2016, everything came crashing down. He was shot dead right outside a house in Kingswood, and the craziest part? It might have been his own gang that turned on him. Michael Davyy wasn't just another name in the Rebels Motorcycle Club, he was a big deal. Known as the Prince of Penrith, he was one of the prominent figures in Sydney's western suburbs, a guy whose reputation was built on both fear and respect. To people who didn't know him well, he was just a bikie, tough, ruthless, and part of an outlaw gang. But to those who did know him, Michael was far more complex. On one hand, he had the nickname Prince of Penrith for a reason. Penrith isn't exactly known for being a peaceful, quiet place, and in a town where power and respect are earned on the street, Michael had carved out a place for himself. He was respected in the Rebels Motorcycle Club, known for his hard-nosed attitude and fearlessness. He wasn't the type of guy you'd want to pick a fight with. He had a presence, a certain way of carrying himself that commanded attention. But then there was the other side of him. Michael wasn't all about violence and intimidation. Behind the tough exterior, he was known to have a softer side, especially when it came to his family. Michael was a father, and those closest to him often described him as someone who'd do anything for his son. It wasn't uncommon to hear stories about him stepping away from the world of crime just to be there for the people he cared about. To some, this side of him made him even more interesting, a man caught between two very different worlds. It's this contrast that made Michael Davyy such a fascinating figure. He wasn't the typical bad guy who lived for chaos. He had a life outside of the rebels, and that life mattered to him. But the world he was part of wasn't one where you could just step out when things got too tough. In the Rebels MC, loyalty was everything, and Michael had earned his place in the club's hierarchy through years of hard work, violence, and, yes, loyalty. But the question was, what happens when loyalty starts to get tested? What happens when, in a world where trust is everything, you can't even trust those closest to you? You see, for Michael Davyy, his involvement in the Rebels was more than just about riding bikes and living fast. It was about maintaining control. The Rebels Motorcycle Club wasn't just a bunch of guys with leather jackets and loud bikes. It was a criminal organization. The club had a foothold in everything from drugs to extortion, and as a member, you had to do what it took to keep climbing the ranks. Michael wasn't just a small-time player. He was well-connected, involved in the high-stakes world of organized crime. But as he climbed higher, it was inevitable that he'd run into trouble, because in the world of outlaw clubs, nothing stays steady for long. There are always power struggles, shifting allegiances, and a constant fear that someone is coming for your spot. That was a constant for Michael, and in the end, it might have been what led to his downfall. Michael's life was a mix of family, loyalty, and danger. His reputation as a tough guy wasn't just about his street smarts, it was about surviving in a world that didn't leave room for mistakes. But even the toughest guys can end up falling victim to the very system they've sworn to be loyal to. So, the big question remains. What led to Michael Davyy's untimely and violent end? Was it a hit by a rival gang? Or was it something much closer to home? Something that came from within his own club? It was just after midnight on March 30th, 2016, when the quiet suburb of Kingswood in western Sydney was shattered by the sound of gunshots. Michael Davyy, the notorious Prince of Penrith, was lying on his driveway, shot multiple times, his life taken in an instant. It was a cold, calculated attack. Witnesses reported hearing the shots echo through the night, but by the time police arrived, Michael was already gone. There was no mistaking it. This was a murder, not just some random act of violence. Whoever had pulled the trigger knew exactly what they were doing. At first, the police couldn't say for sure who was responsible. Was it a rival gang trying to make a statement? The Rebels had enemies, and Sydney's streets were always buzzing with the tension of bicky warfare. Rival clubs like the Hells Angels or the Mongols had long histories of clashes with the Rebels, and a high-profile murder like this one could easily have been the result of turf wars or unpaid debts. But something didn't sit right with the authorities. They quickly began to suspect that the shooting wasn't a random hit by a rival club. The circumstances of Michael's death pointed to something much closer to home. This wasn't just a bicky caught in the crossfire of gang violence. This was personal. Michael wasn't just a member of the Rebels, he was a well-connected and trusted figure within the club. Someone who had been in the game long enough to have made a lot of enemies, but also a lot of allies. So, the question quickly shifted from who did it to why. Why would someone inside the Rebels want Michael Davyy dead? As the investigation began, police were careful not to jump to conclusions. They knew that bicky gangs were notoriously tight-lipped, and getting any information would be like pulling teeth. But one thing was clear. Michael had made a lot of waves, and that might have come back to bite him. There were talks in the community about Michael's connections to the higher-ups in the Rebels and his role in the club's operations. He wasn't just a guy riding around on a bike. He had power, influence, and maybe even enemies within the very club he helped build. The police were starting to realize that this wasn't the type of murder that happened on the streets. This was a political hit, orchestrated by someone within the ranks of the Rebels themselves. But even with that theory brewing in the background, no one had any hard answers. The Rebels, as usual, weren't talking, and in a world where loyalty is everything, it was clear that no one was going to betray their own. But still, the question loomed. Who wanted Michael Davyy gone, and why? Was this a power struggle gone wrong? Or had Michael crossed someone he shouldn't have? At this point, the investigation had barely scratched the surface. The truth was still buried in the shadows, and the police knew that it would take time, and possibly a lot more bodies, to get to the bottom of what had really happened that night in Kingswood. When Michael Davyy was killed, it wasn't just another Bicky murder. This one grabbed attention because it had all the hallmarks of something more sinister. The Rebels Motorcycle Club, notorious for their criminal dealings, was known for making quick work of their enemies. But this case was different. The more the investigators dug, the clearer it became. This wasn't a random hit or a crossfire situation. This was something personal, something that came from within the club itself. After Michael's body was found, the police were quick to launch Strike Force Glenorchy, a special task force dedicated to solving the murder. The usual process of questioning witnesses and gathering evidence started, but police faced a major problem. The people who might have had the answers weren't exactly willing to speak. Bickies don't talk. That's a rule of the game. The rebels weren't about to hand over any information to the authorities, especially not when it came to something as significant as the murder of one of their own. So, what could the police do? They had to rely on old-fashioned detective work. They started by looking into Michael's life before his death. They dug into his history, his relationships, and his rise to power within the rebels. What they found was a man who had worked hard to carve out a place for himself in a world full of violence and betrayal. Michael wasn't just any Bicky. He was an important figure in the club's structure. He had connections, and those connections made him both valuable and, eventually, dangerous to those around him. But the deeper the police went, the more they began to realize that this murder wasn't just about power struggles between gangs or competition for territory. It was about something more, something inside the club. There were whispers of tensions among the rebels, of fractures that had been growing for some time. It wasn't just the usual infighting you'd expect in any gang. These were serious disagreements, the kind that could lead to murder. And that's where the investigation began to shift its focus. This wasn't just about finding a rival gang member with a grudge. It was about identifying who within the rebels had the most to gain from Michael's death. Was it someone he had crossed in the past? Or had someone in the club simply decided that Michael had become too powerful to keep around? Police started looking at other members of the rebels, especially those with close ties to Michael. They scrutinized the dynamics of the club, looking for anyone who might have had a motive. But even then, it wasn't easy. The rebels were known for their tight loyalty, and betrayal within the ranks wasn't something that happened easily. No one was about to start talking without facing serious consequences. The club operated under a code of silence, and that silence extended to everything, including murder. The investigation also ran into another roadblock: the lack of physical evidence. There were no fingerprints on the weapon, no witnesses willing to testify, and no CCTV footage from the area. It was as if Michael's killer had been careful, covering their tracks to ensure that they wouldn't be caught. It was a perfect hit: swift, efficient, and hard to trace. Despite the challenges, the police weren't about to give up. They had a hunch that the key to solving Michael Davy's murder lay within the rebels, and if they could break through the wall of silence, they might just find the answers they were looking for. The investigation was far from over, but with every lead they followed, it became clearer that Michael's death wasn't just another casualty in the ongoing war between rival gangs. It was the beginning of something bigger, a deeper, more complex story of betrayal, power, and danger within the very gang that had once protected him. The Rebels Motorcycle Club wasn't just a group of guys with bikes. They were a well-oiled criminal organization with deep roots in Australia's underworld. Power, loyalty, and fear ruled the club, and for Michael Davyy, climbing through the ranks meant much more than just a leather jacket and a shiny bike. Michael wasn't just a member. He was a key player, a guy with influence who had earned respect in the rebels through sheer force of will. But the higher you go in the club, the more enemies you make. The rebels were a gang driven by one simple truth. Trust only goes so far, and loyalty is easily tested. It didn't matter if you were a Prince of Penrith. Once you rose to the top, you were always vulnerable. Inside the club, there were constant power struggles. Older members, who had been around since the start, saw themselves as the true leaders, while younger, more ambitious members wanted to take control. Michael, like many, had to walk a fine line. He was respected, but he was also seen as a threat by those around him. The internal politics of the rebels were brutal, and it was clear that Michael's death was no random act. The investigation revealed something chilling. The most dangerous enemies weren't necessarily the ones outside the rebels. They were the ones who shared the same patch. In a world where betrayal is common and power is everything, Michael Davy's tragic end was likely the result of an internal struggle for dominance. As the investigation into Michael Davy's death progressed, it quickly became clear that the rebels weren't going to make it easy. Law enforcement had little to go on. No solid leads, no witnesses willing to talk, and no obvious suspects. It was as if the club had built an impenetrable wall of silence. In a world where loyalty meant everything, snitching was worse than death. But while the rebels clammed up, the police weren't ready to give up. They started looking deeper into Michael's life. Who did he trust? Who had he been close to? Who might have had the most to gain from his death? They began to focus on a smaller group within the club, those who were closest to Michael, people he had worked with and perhaps crossed. The investigation started uncovering stories of tension and power struggles within the rebels. It wasn't just the usual rivalry with other gangs. There were whispers of deep rifts within the club itself. Members who once stood shoulder to shoulder were now eyeing each other warily, all jostling for a bigger piece of the pie. And Michael, with his high status, had unknowingly become a target. Detectives also dug into Michael's past, looking for anyone who might have had a motive to kill him. They found that Michael's life wasn't just filled with loyal bickies. There were people who resented him, maybe even hated him. His growing power had made him a target both outside the rebels and, potentially, within it. And those close to him, those who were most likely involved in the murder, weren't going to make the job of finding the killer easy. While the police had theories, the truth was still locked behind a wall of secrecy. It was clear that whoever had killed Michael wasn't just some random hitman. This murder had all the signs of an internal betrayal, the kind of backstabbing that only happens when loyalty is pushed to its breaking point. The question remained: who in the rebels had finally decided Michael Davy's time was up? Months after Michael Davy's murder, the investigation into his death was still struggling to break open. The rebels were proving as tight-lipped as ever, and there was little physical evidence to lead investigators to the killer. But as time passed, the cracks in the club's wall of silence started to show. In August 2018, 2 former members of the Rebels Motorcycle Club were arrested in connection with Michael's murder. The police had finally gathered enough evidence to make their move. Michael's death, it seemed, had been the result of an internal betrayal, just as investigators had suspected. The 2 men charged were well-known figures within the rebels, and their arrests sent shockwaves through the bikie community. The first arrest was of a man named Jason J. Plummer, a former high-ranking member of the rebels. The second was David Stitch Rumble, another ex-member who had once been close to Michael. Both men were allegedly involved in Michael's killing, and their arrest raised even more questions about what had truly happened within the rebels. For the police, this was a major breakthrough. The arrests not only validated their suspicions that Michael's death was an inside job, but also indicated that the rebels were far from the unified, untouchable force they once were. In fact, it seemed as though the club's internal tensions were starting to spill over into violence, and Michael Davyy had been the unfortunate victim of this deadly power struggle. As the trial loomed, the public began to learn more about the motivations behind the murder. It wasn't just a simple case of someone wanting Michael out of the picture. No, this was far more complicated. The police revealed that the two men arrested had been involved in a dispute with Michael over the rebels' operations and leadership. Michael, who had been a powerful and influential figure within the gang, had stepped on some very sensitive toes. In a world where power is everything, stepping on the wrong toes could be a death sentence. The arrest of these two men also shed light on just how fractured the rebels had become. It was no longer a club united by a common cause. It was a collection of fractured factions, each with their own agendas. Michael had been at the center of this conflict, and in the end, it was his ambition and his position within the club that made him a target. With the arrests, the investigation took a sharp turn, and suddenly the focus shifted from just trying to figure out who did it to understanding why it had happened. Why did two former rebels feel the need to eliminate Michael? What had gone wrong within the club? The answers were still unfolding, but one thing was becoming clearer. Michael's death wasn't just another Bicky murder. It was the result of a dangerous mix of ambition, betrayal, and fractured loyalty that had torn the rebels apart from the inside. After the arrests of Jason Plummer and David Rumble, Michael Davy's murder seemed to have found a conclusion. But the reality of the aftermath was far from simple. The rebels' motorcycle club was in turmoil, and the public and law enforcement were left to piece together the chaos that had led to Michael's tragic death. In the years following the murder, the rebels were visibly fractured. The power struggles that had long simmered under the surface were now out in the open, and the club was no longer the feared and unified force it once had been. Rivalry and suspicion had driven a wedge between members, and even though the arrests brought some sense of justice for Michael, they also highlighted the deep cracks within the gang's structure. For the police, the aftermath meant a renewed focus on the remaining rebels' members. With two key figures arrested and facing trial, there was still a question of whether others in the club would step forward with more information. The arrest of former members only confirmed what had long been suspected. Michael's death wasn't an isolated event, but part of a larger pattern of internal power struggles that threatened to tear the rebels apart. Meanwhile, the families and friends of Michael Davyy were left to pick up the pieces of his life. Michael had been a father, a friend, and a man who had built his reputation with grit and determination. His death, though an inevitable result of the world he lived in, left a hole in the lives of those who knew him. But the harsh truth was that in a world like the rebels, loyalty and betrayal are part of the game. Michael's tragic end was just another chapter in a much larger story of violence, ambition, and conflict. The legal battle was still ongoing as the trial for Plummer and Rumble began, but even as the court case moved forward, the broader implications of Michael's death hung over the rebels. What had once been a tight-knit and powerful organization was now fractured and uncertain. Other Bicky clubs, who had long eyed the rebels' territory and influence, were now seeing an opportunity to move in and claim what was once theirs.
It's a blistering December day in 2022, the kind of heat that bakes the pavement. Carl Lebrook, the president of the Rebels Motorcycle Club in Western Australia, is cruising along in his shiny BMW, grinning like he's got the world in his pocket. Little does he know, he's about to make a massive mistake that's going to bring the whole club to its knees. The cops pull him over, and what they find is jaw-dropping, a whopping $210,000 in cash. This isn't just another routine bust. This is the start of the rebels' downfall. A few weeks later, the club's boss and a well-known horse trainer appear in court over a bust during the Christmas season, accused of trying to disguise $500,000 as holiday gifts. Investigators believe that Kelly Clay, a high-profile figure in the horse racing world, and Lebrook were the masterminds behind the scheme. And as the news explains, their connection goes way deeper than anyone realized. Since that day, the rebels have been fighting to keep everything together, dealing with betrayal, and the looming threat of the club collapsing. For motorcycle clubs, especially the rebels, loyalty is everything. But when that loyalty is broken, the consequences are serious. Getting kicked out is the least of your worries. In some cases, it's a matter of life and death. So, what happens when a longtime leader of the rebels feels like he's been stabbed in the back by his own president? Well, that's exactly what went down between Lebrook and Damon V, the national president of the rebels. This is a tale about loyalty, betrayal, and the price you pay when you break the trust of those closest to you. Carl Lebrook's arrest could very well mark the end of the rebels in Western Australia, a chapter in their story that's been written in crime and controversy for years. Not much is known about Lebrook's early life, but one thing's clear: he was a criminal from the start. Lebrook's criminal record stretches way back, tied up with violent crimes, drugs, financial scams, and even high-speed chases. If you're wondering why he's been under the police's radar for the last 20 years, his past might just be the answer. Add to that his connections to heavyweights like Rebel Rick, and it's easy to see why the cops have had their eye on him for so long. His first brush with the law, it dates all the way back to 2001. Carl Lebrook's criminal journey took a wild turn back in the early 2000s. After being locked up for dealing drugs with several other rebels gang members, he was part of a huge bust when the gang set up a drug operation at the Metropolis Hotel. The cops came down hard on them, and Lebrook's supposed rehabilitation after his time in jail turned out to be a joke. Instead of turning his life around, he just stepped up his game by moving into manufacturing drugs. In 2010, the police caught up with him again, but by then, Lebrook had made a fortune and earned serious street cred in the underground Aussie scene. Most people would think that 2 stints in prison would help someone change, but not Carl Lebrook. In 2013, he found himself back behind bars after a high-speed chase with the cops, which ended in a crash and him going straight to prison. After serving his time for that, it seemed like Lebrook might have turned over a new leaf, but his ongoing ties with the rebels soon proved otherwise. In December 2022, Carl Lebrook hit the headlines once again, but this time, it could be the one that sends him away for a long time. Lebrook had been under police surveillance for over 20 years, and even though he knew the cops were always watching him, he still made a huge mistake. While driving his flashy BMW, Lebrook had a suspicious package in the back seat, even though he wasn't supposed to be driving. It almost seemed like he had a death wish. The police stopped him, and instead of trying to run, like in 2013, they searched his car. In the back seat, they found 2 cases wrapped up like Christmas presents. When the cops opened them, they discovered way more than festive surprises. Inside the wrapping, they found stacks of cold hard cash, a total of $210,000. Yep, over $200,000 in cash. And if that wasn't bad enough for Lebrook, luck, or more likely his own confession, led police to Kelly Clay's car shortly after. When the cops raided Kelly Clay's house, they hit the jackpot. Just like Lebrook's stash, Clay was found with $250,000 wrapped in the same Christmas paper. It was game over for them both. The two were slapped with charges for possession of an unlawfully obtained property, but that was just the tip of the iceberg. What followed was a whirlwind of trouble that neither of them saw coming. After Kelly Clay's conviction and sentencing, Carl Lebrook has been surprisingly cooperative with the police, especially considering his usual attitude towards the law. His latest court appearance made it clear that he's facing an uphill battle, with the prosecution having him backed into a corner. Lebrook's arrest was caught on camera, and with his history as a repeat offender, it seemed like there was no way out for him. But Lebrook wasn't ready to give up just yet. He decided to take an unconventional route to fight for his freedom, no matter what it took, even if it meant throwing his dead best friend under the bus or breaking the sacred rebel's code of honor. When the court asked him about the $400,000 in cash, Lebrook claimed it was from membership fees for the Rebels Club. He went on to explain that he was storing the money at Kelly Clay's house because his wife had threatened to burn it. At the time, his wife was struggling with severe postnatal depression and, in a fit of rage, had made threats to destroy the money. But it wasn't this revelation that shocked everyone. What Lebrook said next left the entire country in disbelief, and the underworld buzzing with gossip. He spoke about Nick Martin, the Rebels president in Western Australia, who was also his best friend. Martin had been murdered in 2020, shot by a sniper while watching drag races with his family at the crowded Kwinana Motorplex. The man responsible for the fatal shot admitted his guilt, but Lebrook's revelation about Martin took things to a whole new level. Lebrook told the court that he had confronted Martin hours before his death in a meeting that lasted over 4 hours. Why? Because Lebrook had been orchestrating a coup against his best friend. According to Lebrook, Martin had been using Rebels membership money to renovate his mansion, stealing from the very club he led. In Lebrook's eyes, this was a betrayal so severe that Martin had to be removed. And while Martin wasn't happy about it, he didn't live long enough to fight back. Just months after the coup, he was killed by the sniper. This bombshell about Martin sent shockwaves through Australia's underground scene. Martin had been a respected figure in the Rebels, so to hear these accusations about him in a court of law was completely unexpected. In the Rebels, there's an unspoken rule. You never speak ill of your leader, especially not in a public setting like court. But Lebrook broke that rule without hesitation. The trial has clearly taken its toll on Lebrook, and it's easy to understand why he decided to cooperate with the police in hopes of easing his situation. At the time, he probably thought this case was the worst thing he'd ever face. But what came next proved to be far worse. In 2023, the courts managed to get an anti-consorting order against Lebrook. This order effectively cut him off from communicating with his fellow bikers, who were like family to him. This isolation has left Lebrook vulnerable, and the police know it. He could very well be at his weakest point yet. Carl Lebrook has also found himself in the middle of an investigation for a drive-by shooting in Davyy, where a Mongol gang member's house was shot up. The police have strong reasons to believe that Lebrook was involved, but even though his legal troubles have been nightmarish, they don't even begin to compare to the hell he's been facing. From the Rebels' national president, Davyy Lebrook has seen his fair share of heartache during his years with the Rebels. He's watched friends, and what he considers family, die because of their loyalty to the club. He's seen others go to prison for years on end. Through all this, he's stuck by the Rebels, remaining a loyal member for over 25 years. But when Davyy questioned his loyalty and integrity just after his court appearance, Lebrook was furious. Lebrook fired back, insisting that he held no ill will toward Nick Martin, who had been his best friend. In fact, he'd even spoken at Martin's funeral. He remembered Martin as a hardworking guy, although their early years together hadn't been easy. Lebrook shared a memory from their past when he convinced Martin to take a job with him. They ended up confronting a man who owed Martin money. While Lebrook went 5 houses down to the guy's mom's place, Martin came charging out of the front door, balancing a brand new massive plasma TV, which was rare back then. Lebrook couldn't understand why Davyy would accuse him of lying about his friendship with Martin. After Lebrook's testimony in court, Davyy was furious and demanded Lebrook submit the court transcripts so that V could determine if he had broken the Rebels' code of honor. Lebrook, already facing a ton of trouble, shot back angrily, telling V to get the transcripts like everyone else. This sparked even more tension between them. V threatened to punish Lebrook, but before that could happen, Lebrook made a huge decision. He handed in his colors and quit the club he had called home for over 30 years. This move shocked the Rebels. After Lebrook's testimony, the National Rebels executive accused him of selling out and threatened him with punitive action. In retaliation, Lebrook quit and walked away from the Rebels for good. But things didn't end there. The West Australian chapter of the Rebels, which Lebrook had led, agreed with everything he had said about Nick Martin. They backed Lebrook's claims that Martin had stolen from them and had ruled over them with an iron fist. They had no issue with Lebrook telling the truth, even in a court of law. When Davyy pressured Lebrook into resigning, the West Australian chapter stood by him in solidarity. In an unprecedented move, 37 members of the West Australian Rebels chapter followed Lebrook's lead and quit the club as well. This mass resignation was the biggest in Rebels history, and it became known as the Great Resignation in the Australian biker community. It was a defining moment for the Rebels, marking the collapse of an era. The mass resignation sent shockwaves through the underground world and might just signal the end of the Rebels as we know them in Western Australia. The 37 members who left the West Australian chapter didn't follow the usual tradition of leaving their Harley bikes behind. They took them with them as a bold act of defiance against Davyy. Now, it looks like they'll either join another club or possibly even start a new one under Carl Lebrook, assuming he doesn't end up serving a long prison sentence. The rebels are currently locked in a brutal battle with the Mongols, with many rebels members already behind bars because of it. The resignation of over 36 members means the rebels are at their weakest, and the Mongols are likely on track to win the war on the west coast. The end of the rebels could be on the horizon, but what might come sooner is Lebrook's time in prison. The resignation was also sparked by what many members see as mismanagement and poor leadership by Davyy 5, who has struggled to keep the club united since taking control. Carl Lebrook is officially no longer a member of the rebels, but his legal battles are far from over. With his criminal history, if he's found guilty of the charges against him, he could be looking at a long stint behind bars, and the police will be hoping for just that. His accomplice, Kelly Clay, has already been convicted, which makes it seem likely that Lebrook will follow the same fate. Even if the charge of possession of stolen goods doesn't stick, the charge of driving without authority might be enough to land Lebrook a prison sentence, though probably a shorter one. Whatever the final outcome, one thing is certain: the rebels in the Australian underworld will never be the same. Whether this marks the beginning of a new era or the fall of the rebels, only time will tell.